You look at a nation like Israel, they're like a postage stamp. And there's a demagogue in our midst on the international stage, Ahmadinejad, president of Iran, who has basically said he wants to see them wiped off the face of the map, the face of the earth, gone. Now, should we be concerned when a demagogue wants to enrich uranium and gain nuclear capabilities? Should we be concerned? Absolutely. When someone says something like that, and they have the weaponry and seeking the weaponry to carry it out, they need to be taken seriously. I mean, in the middle of the last century, we had a demagogue who pretty much wanted to do the same thing. His name was Hitler. And he went about doing it. And millions of people lost their lives. Yeah, we are not going to be on the wrong side of that issue again. Particularly as a man of color who knows the history of Jews being involved in advancing the causes of people of color. Black-Jewish relations go back centuries, centuries. When you look at the enslavement of Jewish people during the days of the Egyptian dynasties, now those were blacks in charge. I mean, it was the most powerful nation on the planet at the time, and they enslaved Jewish people. Now, these Jewish people weren't necessarily descendants of Japheth. These were more direct descendants of Shem, but nonetheless, the black-Jewish connection was there. And when the Exodus occurred, the scriptures clearly say that a mixed multitude left Egypt. That means Egyptians were traveling with Jews to the promised land. Of course, spending a time in the wilderness, but on their way to the promised land, a mixed multitude, Egyptians and Jews. So there was a connection again. You can fast forward all the way to the turn of the last century. The black-Jewish connection, particularly with the founding of the NAACP. Now, here's a little known fact. Many people don't even realize that W.E.B. Du Bois did not start the NAACP by himself. There were prominent Jewish Americans alongside him seeing this movement through. The Spingarn family, Joel Spingarn, professor at Columbia University, Arthur Spingarn, activist of the day, and another Jewish man, Henry Moskowitz. Now, he was a civil rights activist for Jewish causes at the turn of the last century. These men were deeply involved in spearheading the birthing of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And Jewish people were alongside people of color to see that through. And at the birth, they birthed it around the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth. Very interesting correlation there too. But nonetheless, bear in mind, with that kind of history, we need to be closer than we are today. We need to be closer. And we can't forget that the NAACP served a righteous cause, Its embryonic stages were during a time of wanting to see injustices eliminated. Yeah, these things can't be forgotten. And if they are, then again, we're being intellectually dishonest. And even up as recent as 1984, you had Jack Greenberg, Jewish man, attorney, succeeded Thurgood Marshall. So the Jewish African-American connection, once again, is just undeniable. It's just powerful. So we can't forget men and women who are of African descent, particularly in this hemisphere, in this country, can't forget the help that came from the Jewish American community to see our causes advanced, to see them through. And that happened all the way up to the Civil Rights era. You had the prominent Jewish people involved in that as well. Dr. King was fully aware of the sacrifice that Jewish people were making for the Civil Rights movement in the 60s. You had one rabbi, prominent theologian. His name was Abraham Joshua Heschel. I mean, you don't get any more. Abraham Joshua, Jewish rabbi, theologian, walking with Dr. King in Selma. And Dr. King fully understood the importance of standing with Jewish people. And he was an ardent Zionist. We don't get too much into that regarding Dr. King's life. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King. 1965, right around the time of Selma, Alabama, right around the time of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Dr. Martin Luther King regarding anti-Semitism. I think we should all take a note. How could there be anti-Semitism among Negroes when our Jewish friends have demonstrated their commitment to the principle of tolerance and brotherhood, not only in the form of sizable contributions, but in many other tangible ways, often at great personal sacrifice? Can we ever express our appreciation to the rabbis who chose to give moral witness with us in St. Augustine during our recent protest against segregation in that unhappy city? Dr. King reading on, need I remind anyone of the awful beating suffered by Rabbi Arthur Levelfeld of Cleveland when he joined the civil rights workers in Hattiesburg, Mississippi? And how can we ever forget the sacrifice of two Jewish lives, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, in the swamps of Mississippi? It would be impossible to record the contribution that the Jewish people have made toward the Negro struggle for freedom. It has been so great. Now here's the pinnacle representative of the civil rights movement, understanding the importance. Now we've taken our cues as men of color and people of color in this nation from Dr. Martin Luther King, and here he is giving a pretty sizable cue. We need to be closer knit with the Jewish American community. Not only that, to the cause of Jewry worldwide, if it means their survivability, and it does right now, especially with the existential threats that exist today against the nation state of Israel. Well, I think that has to deal with, when you look at the Nation of Islam and their inroads into the black community, I think that has a lot to do with more empowerment. I think that maybe because the civil rights movement kind of faded away and we have men like Jesse Jackson making comments like Hymietown, so hurtful, so damaging to black-Jewish relations. And what tends to emerge is a desire within young men to want to be empowered. And I think deception is at foot here. Deception. Because you have to be deceived in order to ignore the obvious philanthropy and sensitivity of heart of Jewish people towards the cause of African Americans in the United States of America. You have to be blind to that. And you have to be deceived if you're not paying attention to that. Now here, Israel is a nation state, postage stamp out in the Middle East, completely surrounded by their enemies. And we have a demagogue, which I've mentioned already, decrying their existence. We, as people of color, can't ignore that, especially men of God who hold the scriptures dear. We wouldn't have the scriptures, according to Paul, were it not for Jewish people. Were it not for meticulously taking down the Word of God and scribing it, we wouldn't have it. What we hold dear as people of God came from Israel, and we need to defend the land and the people. You know, there is a shared and common theme between the two, African Americans and Jewish Americans, or just people of African descent, Jews worldwide, that hatred for these two people groups emerges in the hearts of others. For example, the eugenics movement. Few people realize the eugenics movement was designed strictly to control the population growth of the African American community post-emancipation. Turn of the last century, a man by the name of Francis Galton, who, by the way, is a cousin to Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin, with his scientific and biological-oriented preservation of favored races and of survival of the fittest. Well, he took that theme and made it social. His cousin took that theme, made it social. And it's about survival of the social fittest. And the least fit in the society were African Americans, according to the estimation of the eugenics movement crowd. They would use terms like unfit, feeble-minded, imbecile, human weeds. Those types of terms were all code words for basically freed slaves and their ancestors. We need to limit that population. Well, that kind of concept of eliminating or curtailing the growth of a people group is very familiar to Jewish people. Very familiar. The eugenics movement in the United States caught wind by the Nazis. The Nazis in Germany, they were sharing information with each other about how to control people groups, how to control those quote-unquote human weeds in your society. For the Germans, it was Jews. They wanted them eliminated. And blacks too. They were experimenting on black people as well in Germany in certain parts and conducting experiments that were appalling. So the eugenics movement in the United States and the Nazi movement in Germany, both trying to squelch and curtail two people groups. Here we are now on familiar ground, both blacks and Jews, hated by the same groups of people. We are one in those causes, and we need not forget that. We need not forget it. And that spirit still exists today. There are people on this planet who want to see Israel gone. Gone. And as a man of God, as long as there's breath in my lungs, I won't stand for it. I won't stand for it. And as a man of color, knowing that that Jewish people have been involved in advancing the cause of people of color, not only here in the United States, but in my native Jamaica, the same thing. Moses Delgado, he was a civil rights activist. He moved to see people of African descent on the island of Jamaica have some civil rights as well. I mean, the list goes on and on. Jewry is about healing the world, and they take it seriously, and they do it. You think about the Israeli government during the last earthquake in Haiti, devastating circumstances in Haiti. The Israeli government was the first field hospital on the land, the first field hospital. So much so, they were so first in their efforts that a woman gave birth to a son and named the boy Israel. Named him Israel. Yeah, Tekun Elam. It means to heal the world. And they've been doing it for centuries, even though they've been hated. Hated. So I'm going to stand with Israel. And I think we in the African community, both African American or Africans anywhere, particularly people of God, we need to remember the connections, the shared struggle, and stand with them. In a time when their existence is being threatened, we need to stand. My family is from Jamaica, the western side of Jamaica, Negril. And my great-grandfather was Portuguese, but predominant people in my family are of African descent. And this funny thing about Portuguese Jamaicans is that a lot of them are there because of the Inquisition. Now the Inquisition, 1492, caused an exodus of Jews from Spain and Portugal, and they scattered throughout the Caribbean, running for their lives. Some of them faked becoming Catholics. They're called conversos. Then you have the Moranos. And they were so persecuted that they used to put sand on their synagogue floor so they wouldn't be heard worshiping on Saturday. Now, when I went back to Jamaica this past year, I had the privilege of going to a synagogue in Jamaica that is 100 years old and have members in it whose descendants go back 600 years. I mean, these are Portuguese, white Portuguese Jamaicans, still on the island celebrating their Jewry. And that type of Jewry is Sephardic Jewry, which is different from Ashkenaz, which is more Western European. So that connection is still there. Jews were involved in civil rights in Jamaica. You had Moses Delgado, who was a Jewish civil rights person. He fought to see injustices within the Jewish community that were perpetrated by the British on Jews in Jamaica. They couldn't own land, they couldn't own businesses, anything of that sort. And Moses Delgado was a civil rights activist on behalf of the Jewish community in Jamaica. And they were granted the opportunity to do so, to own businesses, own land, things of that nature. They were deeply involved in educating the slaves in Jamaica, Portuguese Jews. They did not want to see that injustice go on. So even there in the Caribbean, you have a black Jewish connection that is good. That's good. Now some may say, well, look, some of these, Jews were enslaving and working for the man and doing all that kind of. Some may say that. And don't get me wrong, not all Jewish people are great people, but the vast majority want to see injustices eliminated. Then there was Jacob Cordova. He was a Portuguese Jew from Jamaica. He wound up in Texas and was a part of the founding of Waco. So that's an interesting link that a lot of people don't know about. Jacob Cordova. So Jewry in Jamaica, Jewry in the United States, it's been a benefit. It's been a help to people of African descent. It hasn't hurt. It's been a help in some pretty significant ways and should not be ignored. And I, for one, will not. Oh my goodness, Roy Wilson's mom, sweet lady. She was in Alabama during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and of course back in the mid-60s, 65 with the March in Selma. She housed Northern Jews in her home. And that's different for them, having white people in their home, but they were Jewish, so it was different because they were there to help. They didn't care that they stayed in the home of a person of color. They didn't look at it that way. It was a fellow man, a fellow human being. And that's the way it should be. And that's personal sacrifice. Her pastor stood up and said, listen, we've got some activists coming down who are Jewish. They're coming to help us. Can you house them? And she said, yes, we'll do it. And my friend Roy, whom you've met as well, he tells a story of Jewish men in his house. He went and visited one. I think one of them was from Chicago, and that's a story that's really going to have to be really dug into and explored, because very few people see that. They think civil rights and it was all black. Now there were some white people, Jewish, Eastern European, of Eastern European descent, helping the cause and willing to link arm in arm and sleep in the same quarters for the cause. Beautiful story. Yeah, that Roy's encounter with these house guests, sleeping on the couch and on the floor, who really flipped his paradigm on white people, because these people were nice. They weren't trying to kill him. They weren't trying to hurt him. And it really helped shape his understanding that not all people of European descent are evil and wicked. Jewish people particularly were very kind, very willing to lay down their lives for the cause, and he knew about it. He knew about it. And when he got older, he went and visited the man who visited him. Look, PJTN to me is an organization that is a tip of the spear type of organization. She's willing to do hard things, take hard positions on matters that some people want to back away from. Proclaiming justice to the nations. I mean, that's in line with God's great commission to the church, which go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them all things that I've commanded you. Now, I look at PJTN as a voice a didactic voice, a teaching voice on the national stage and international stage for the cause of Israel and educating those regarding who should support her and why we should support her. And as a man of color in this world, partnering with an organization like PJTN is an easy yes, because they're educated, they're education oriented. They want to tell stories that few people want to approach or few people find interesting, but they do, and they make it interesting. They make it interesting. And Stan and Lori are just great people. I love them to death.